own right. But I want to tell you something. I want you to help you understand that these movements never come without failure. And they never come without great sacrifice. They are the overnight successes that were decades in the making. They were not just something that someone dreamed up and stepped into and did everything properly from day one. So I'd like to tell you a story. My parents were trained by Southern Baptists in America to be pastors and to be church planters. My mother's a graduate of Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary with a master's in religious education. My father has a master's of divinity from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. While they were in the United States, they planted 5 churches. 2 were among deaf congregations. Both of them speak fluent sign language. And so they were known in the States for being quite successful. Not known in big circles, but known in small circles. They had done what many hadn't. And God called them to the mission field. He called them to work in Malaysia. And they ended up receiving that call, and they ended up traveling to Hong Kong, where they would spend some time learning the language. They were commissioned by what was then known as the Foreign Mission Board of the Southern Baptists. Now you guys would probably know them as the International Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention. So we landed in Malaysia. My mom, my dad, we left the United States in 1985. I was 7 years old. My brother was 4.5. It was an interesting trip. That was back in the days when they allowed smoking on airplanes. And back in the days when you had one rickety film screen in the front that showed movies that no one even bothered to see in the cinema. And so it was a miserable trip. We actually had to stop and refuel halfway across because the planes then couldn't make the whole trip, unlike they can now. They can just go straight shots now. That wasn't possible back then. And I remember the food being horrible. I remember throwing up in the air sickness bag. I remember just being bored out of my mind and landing into a new place and not being able to sleep. And all those kind of things that go with coming and making a transition of thousands of miles. My parents immediately settled into language school and began learning the process. They came alongside a team that was planting a church in Hong Kong because they weren't the type to sit idly even while they were learning the language. But it wasn't too long after we moved there, perhaps 6 months or so, 3 months, when we got a call from my parents' bosses, and they said, "Look, we want you to go ahead and apply for your visa to Malaysia." And my parents are like, "Well, why? Why would we want to do something like that? We've only been here for 3 months and we've got 4 years before we know the language and we're struggling as it is right now." And they said, "Well, we want you to go ahead and apply because we've projected out in about 3 years, all of the missionaries in Malaysia will have retired or be back home on their stateside assignments. And so we're worried that Malaysia, already a place that seemed to be closing, if we got all the missionaries out of the country, that they would take advantage and not allow any of them back in. And so we want you to go in just as the rest are going out." Well, my mom and my dad thought about that a bit, and they said, "Well, we'll pray about it, and okay, we got to go ahead and apply." And so they got off the phone, and my mother, she hit her knees and she talked to the Lord a little bit. She said, "Father, you've sent us here to learn the language in order to minister to the Chinese-speaking peoples in Malaysia when we go there. Well, we're not doing so good with the language bit. I just found out that every time I'd gone to the restaurant to order white rice, that I'd actually been ordering heroin. The other day when my husband, we all got in the cab, my husband sat there and said our address, and the taxi driver couldn't understand where we were going, tried to drive us one place. We ended up finding out and redirecting him to the right place. And when we asked our language school teacher what we had done wrong, she started laughing because we told her to take us to the local bordello instead of local missionary housing. And so that's not working so well, Father, this language thing. In fact, I was just at McDonald's last night. I asked for 2 Cokes, and they gave me an order of pancakes. So we're not quite ready to go to Malaysia. But then she said those words that everyone says because they think that God will twisting God's arm to get what we want rather than actually submitting ourselves to God's will, right? And she said, "But not my will, Father, but thine be done." Well, 3 months later, our visas were granted to Malaysia. The fastest missionary visas granted to Southern Baptists in Malaysia in history. Also, the last missionary visas granted to any missionary organization that I'm aware of into Malaysia to this day. And so we went in. We packed everything up. We moved to Petaling Jaya, just outside of Kuala Lumpur. We settled in quickly. My father became a pastor of a church there in PJ that was known for, sort of known because they kind of pushed the limits on what the government would allow them to do in terms of reaching out to Muslims and ministering to Muslims. My father was a part of starting about 17 underground churches with Muslim background believers. It was illegal to convert in Malaysia. And things were going quite well. But then the government found out what was going on, and under the guise of martial law, they arrested all 17 of those pastors. They beat them so badly that many of them lost function of their kidneys and left the ministry altogether. They placed my family under house arrest. And that sounds a little bit more dramatic than it really was. What that meant was we couldn't have anyone over. We kind of had to stay at home as much as possible. That they read all of our mail, and that they censored anything they thought would be encouraging us to stay in the country. That they would listen on the other end of the phone line. In fact, in those days, technology wasn't as advanced. And you can actually hear them breathing on the other end of the line. And my father likes to tell a story. I don't know if it's a true story or not, or maybe it's just a joke, that he could actually, after he hung up with someone, he'd say, "Goodbye, John," and then, "Goodbye, David," and they'd hang up, and he'd wait a couple of heartbeats and go, "Goodbye, Muhammad," and, "Good night, Mr. Watson," and hang up then. So I don't know if that's a true story or not, if he was just joking with me a bit, but that was what it was like. You could actually know that there was a person on the other end of the line. My father was able to still continue preaching in the church, but there were 2 plainclothes officers who would stand at the back and take the names of everyone who associated with us at the church and who attended the church, and then they would go and grill the people and interrogate them about all their interactions with different people for hours and hours. So things were a bit rough, and after that time, we weren't under house arrest for very long, but after that time, they revoked our visas. Myself, my mother, my younger brother, because on the basis of us being political undesirables, because a 11-year-old and a 10-year-old and a then 6-year-old were political activists that were very dangerous. But back then, those were the days before computers. And, my family historically has always been creative in our interpretation of the law. We were, just to let you know, we used to be British. We came to the United States in 1617 as 4 debtors. And 4 brothers who were debtors that landed on the shores of America in order to pay off our debt. And so we've always had a creative interpretation of things, and we find little loopholes in those kind of things. That's kind of my spiritual heritage that God has redeemed for His purpose. In the fact that we found out you could travel down to Singapore, be outside of the country for 2 weeks while they changed the guards, the immigration officials, and then come back into Malaysia on a 9-month tourist visa. And you could do that every 9 months. And live quite comfortably. So that's what we did. We ended up going out of the country, going out to Malaysia, or down to Singapore, or going up to Thailand, staying there for 2 weeks, and then coming back in on a tourist visa. And we did that for about 1.5 years. It wasn't exactly a secret. I mean, one time the immigration official looked at the passport and looked at my mother, and he goes, "You come to Malaysia a lot." And she's like, "Yes." "Why?" "Because my husband lives here." "Is your husband Malaysian?" "No." "What is he?" "He's an American." "Does your husband have a visa?" "Yes, he does." "Well, why don't you have visas?" "Well, because the government took them away from us." "Why would we do that?" "Well, because my husband's a missionary and because we're missionaries." "Oh, okay." Stamped the passport, let us right into the country. And we did that for some time until it became obvious to us that our presence in Malaysia was no longer helping the ministry. It was actually putting our friends and our neighbors in jeopardy. And then my parents began praying about what next. So the first failure, I guess, would be a missionary couple that hadn't even finished their first term before getting arrested and thrown out of the country they were supposed to live in, and now having to find a new people group and a new place to work. Back in the generation where you camped and lived in one place your whole life. So that was our first failure. They began praying for what was next, and a guy named David Garrison gave them a call. You guys may have known him now as the author of Church Planting Movements, How God is Redeeming a Lost World. But back then, he hadn't come out with that yet. He had just finished writing a pamphlet called The Non-Resident Missionary. And he called my dad, and he said, David, which is going to get confusing because there's two Davids. We're going to call them Watson and Garrison. He said, Watson, he says, it's come to my attention that you guys are praying about a new place to go. And we're just starting a new program, and we'd like you to be part of it. And he said, well, what's the program? And he said, well, it's called the Non-Resident Missionary Program. My father's like, whoa, wait a second. A non-resident missionary? What is that?